The castle of Az-Zubair, Abbey Castle, and An-Nizar in Ash-Shik. 3 others were in Part 2, Al-Khamis, Al-Wadi'a, and As-Salim. The actual operation begins. The Prophet, PBUH, began the campaign by reducing the minor strongholds one after the other. The first fort he was to attack was Naim, the first defense line with a formidable strategic position. Marhab, the leader of the fort, invited Amr bin al-Aqwa to meet him in combat, and the latter responded. When Amr struck the Jew, his sword recoiled and wounded his knee, and he died of that wound. The Prophet, PBUH, later said, "For him, Amir, there is a double reward in the hereafter." He indicated this by putting 2 of his fingers together. Ali bin Abi Talib then undertook to meet Marhab in combat and managed to kill him. Yasir, Marhab's brother, then turned up challenging the Muslims to a fight. Az-Zubair was equal to it and killed him on the spot. Real fighting then broke out and lasted for a few days. The Jews showed courage and proved to be too formidable even to the repeated rushes of the veteran soldiers of Islam. However, they later realized the futility of resistance and began to abandon their positions in a name and infiltrate the fortress of As-Sab. Al-Habib bin al-Muntir al-Ansari led the attack on the As-Sab fortress and laid siege to it for 3 days after which the Muslims stormed it with a lot of booty, provisions, and food to fall to their lot therein. This victory came in the wake of the Prophet's, PBUH, invocation to Allah to help Banu Aslam in their relentless and daring attempts to capture that fort. During the process of the war operations, extreme hunger struck the Muslims. They lit fires, slaughtered domestic asses, and began to cook them. When the Prophet, PBUH, inquired about the fires and cooking, he ordered that they throw away the meat and wash the cooking pots, forbidding the practice of eating such meat. The Jews, meanwhile, evacuated An-Nadal and barricaded themselves in Az-Zubair fort, a formidable defensive position inaccessible to both cavalry and infantry. The Muslims besieged it for 3 days, but in vain. A Jew spy told the Prophet about a subterranean water source that provided them with water and advised that it be cut off in order to undermine their resistance. The Prophet, PBUH, did that, so the Jews got out to engage with the Muslims in fierce fighting, during which some Muslims and 10 Jews were killed, but the fort was eventually conquered. Shortly after this battle, the Jews moved to Abbey Castle and barricaded themselves inside. The same events recurred. The Muslims besieged the new site for 3 days, and then the great Muslim hero Abu Duyana Samik bin Karsha al-Ansari, of the Red Ribbon, led the Muslim army and broke into the castle, conducted fierce military operations within, and forced the remaining Jews to flee for their lives into another fort, An-Nizar. An-Nizar was the most powerful fort, and the Jews came to the established conviction that it was too immune to be stormed, so they deemed it a safe place for their children and women. The Muslims, however, were not dismayed but dragged on the siege, but because standing at a commanding top, the fort was impregnable. The Jews inside were too cowardly to meet the Muslims in the open fights, but rather hurled a shower of arrows and stones at the attackers. Considering this situation, the Prophet, PBUH, ordered that rams be used, and these proved effective and caused cracks in the ramparts, providing easy access into the heart of the fort, where the Jews were put to rout and fled in all directions, leaving behind their women and children. With these series of military victories, the first division of Khaybar was totally reduced, and the Jews in the other minor fortresses evacuated them and fled to the second division. The second part of Khaybar was conquered when the Prophet, PBUH, along with his army, moved to this part of Khaybar, Al-Katiba. He laid a heavy siege to it for 14 days, with the Jews barricading themselves inside their forts. When he was about to use the rams, the Jews realized that they would perish, therefore, they asked for a negotiable peace treaty. There is one controversial point in this context. Was this part of Khaybar, with its 3 forts, conquered by force? Ibn Ishaq clearly stated that the Al-Qamis fort was conquered by force. Al-Waqidi, on the other hand, maintained that the 3 forts were taken through peace negotiations, and force, if any, was resorted to only to hand the fort over to the Muslims. The 2 other forts surrendered without fighting. Negotiations. Ibn Abi al-Haqwaq was dispatched to the Messenger of Allah, PBUH, to negotiate the surrender treaty. The Prophet, PBUH, agreed to spare their lives on condition they evacuate Khaybar and the adjacent land, leaving whatever gold and silver they had in their possession. However, he stipulated that he would disavow any commitment if they concealed anything. Shortly afterward, the forts were handed over to the Muslims and all Khaybar was reduced and brought under the sway of Islam. This treaty notwithstanding, Abi al-Haqwaq's 2 sons concealed a leather bag full of jewels and money belonging to Huyai bin al-Akhtab, who carried it with him when Banu Nadir had been banished. Kanana bin Arabi, who had hidden the musk somewhere, was obdurate in his denial and so he was killed when the musk was discovered and his dishonesty was proven. Abi al-Haqwaq's 2 sons were killed in recompense for breaching the covenant, and Safiya, Huyai's daughter, was taken as a captive. Distribution of spoils. In accordance with the agreement already concluded, the Jews would be obliged to evacuate Khaybar, but they were anxious to keep on cultivating the rich soil and fine orchard for which Khaybar was famous. They, therefore, approached the Prophet, PBUH, with the request that they be allowed to cultivate their lands and they would give half of the produce to the Muslims. Muhammad, PBUH, was kind enough to accede to their request. The messenger, PBUH, divided the land of Khaybar into 2, one half to provide the food to be stored in case of any accidental calamity that might befall the Muslims, and for entertaining the foreign delegates who started to frequent Medina a lot. The other half would go to the Muslims who had witnessed Al-Hudaybiyah event whether present or absent. The total number of shares came to 36, of which 18 were given to the people above mentioned. The army consisted of 1,400 men, of whom were 200 horsemen. The horseman was allotted 3 shares and the footman 1. Zad al-Mad 2:137. 138. The spoils taken at Khaybar were so great that Ibn Umar said, "We never ate our fill until we had conquered Khaybar." Aisha, R., is narrated to have said, "Now we can eat our fill of dates." Sahih al-Bukhari 2609. On their return to Medina, the emigrants were able to return to the helpers of Medina all the gifts they had received. All of this affluence came after the conquest of Khaybar and the great economic benefits that the Muslims began to reap. Zad al-Mad 2:148, Sahih Muslim 296. The conquest of Khaybar coincided with the arrival of the Prophet's cousin Jafar bin Abi Talib and his companions along with Abi Musa al-Ash'ari and some Muslims from Abyssinia, Ethiopia. Abu Musa al-Ash'ari narrated that he and over 50 companions, while in Yemen, took a ship that landed them in Abyssinia, Ethiopia, and they happened to meet there Jafar and his companions. He said, "We stayed together until the Prophet, PBUH, sent an envoy asking us to come back. When we returned, we found out that he had already conquered Khaybar, yet he gave us our due shares of the spoils." The advent of those men came at the request made by the Messenger of Allah, PBUH, to Negus, king of Abyssinia, Ethiopia, through a prophetic deputy, Amr bin Umayyah ad-Damari. Negus sent them back, 16 men altogether with their wives and children on 2 boats. The rest of the emigrants had arrived in Medina earlier. Muhadarat Tariq al-Umam al-Islamiyya 128. In the same context, Safiya, whose husband Kanana bin Abi al-Haqwaq was killed for treachery, was taken as a captive and brought along with other prisoners of war. After the permission of the Prophet, PBUH, was sought, Dihya al-Kalbi chose one of them and she happened to be Safiya. The other Muslims, however, advised that Safiya, being the daughter of the chief of Bani Qurayza and Bani Nadir, should be married to the Prophet, PBUH, who agreed to their opinion, invited her to Islam, freed and took her as wife on her embracing Islam. The wedding feast consisted of dates and fat and was held on his way back to Medina at a spot called Sad as Sabha. After the conquest of Khaybar, a Jewish woman called Zainab bint al-Harith offered the Prophet, PBUH, a roasted sheep she had poisoned. He took a mouthful, but it was not to his liking, so he spat it out. After investigation, the woman confessed that she had stuffed the food with poison, alleging that if the eater were a king, she would then rid herself of him, but should he be a prophet, then he would be bound to learn about it. The Prophet, PBUH, however, connived at her treacherous attempt but ordered that she be killed when Bishr bin al-Bara died of that poison. The number of Muslims who were martyred was controversial, but it ranged between 16 and 18, while the number of Jews killed came to 93. The rest of Khaybar also fell to the Muslims. Allah cast fears into the hearts of the people of Fadak, a village standing to the north of Khaybar, and they hastened to ask for peace, and be allowed to leave in safety, and give up their wealth in return for that. The Prophet, PBUH, entered into an agreement with them similar to the previous one with the people of Khaybar. Fadak was exclusively the Prophet's because neither Muslim cavalry nor camelry was involved in the fight thereby.